Okay, perfect. Um, Excellent. Let us get started. Dear guests, welcome. Uh, this is the second installment of our seminar series titled Perspectives on Death, Afterlife, and Reincarnation. The series is co-organized by the Center for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies and the Ibn Arabi Interreligious Research Initiative, both of them at Monash University. My name is Aydoğan, and I will have the pleasure to be your host today. In the first talk in our series, we focused on notions of afterlife in indigenous traditions of Australia. Today, our guest speaker will invite us to look at a rich intellectual tradition that flourished in China, namely Daoism. With its roots tracing back to the 4th century before the Common Era, as we will see today, Daoism has an extremely rich repertoire of ideas and meanings when it comes to the topic of death and afterlife. So we are very happy to have Professor David Chai with us to introduce us the topic of non-finality of death in Daoism. To quickly introduce him, David is an associate professor of philosophy at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He is the principal editor of the book series titled Daoism and the Human Experience at Bloomsbury Publishers. And he has published numerous papers on Chinese and comparative philosophy, including various studies on death and nothingness. He is the author and/or editor of 5 beautiful books. On the screen now, I hope that you can see their titles and appreciate the depth of the scholarship that extends from ancient and medieval Chinese philosophy to metaphysics, phenomenology, and philosophy of religion. Today, David will deliver a 30 to 40-minute talk titled Daoism and the Non-Finality of Death, after which, as usual, we will stop the recording and we will have hopefully around 20 minutes for a live Q&A session with him. It's an honor to have you with us, dear David. So without further ado, I will be now leaving the floor to you. Thank you for joining once again.
Great, thank you very much. I will do my PowerPoint. Okay, I believe you can all see the PPT, is that right?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Well, I'm very honored to be part of this this series, and it would be remiss of me not to give credit where credit is due. So my thanks to the Monash Center for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies and the Ibn Arabi Interreligious Research Institute. The talk that I will give today is about a person who lived nearly 2,500 years ago in the early 4th century BCE in China. His name here on the screen is Zhuangzi. This is a person whose reception amongst Western philosophers is quite long and quite rich. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the writings of Martin Heidegger. Heidegger actually lectured and spoke about the Zhuangzi in some of his conversations. Before Heidegger, we have Martin Buber, who translated the Zhuangzi into German. And Buber's translation is actually the one that Heidegger referred to in his various talks. There are many other philosophers, theologians who found Daoism very attractive. And of course, today, Daoist philosophy is enjoying a bit of a renaissance, if you like. It was neglected for some time as scholars tended to focus on Confucianism. So today, I would like to talk about this particular text named after its reputed author, the Zhuangzi. I will not talk about other Daoist philosophers because I would like to keep things quite straightforward. But in order to really understand the Taoist concept of death, we need to preface this with an understanding of the Taoist concept of change, because the two are connected. The Zhuangzi gives us a very nice example here of what it and the ancient Chinese understood to be change and the role of change in the world. And the text says, and I quote, "Heaven is honorable and earth is lowly." So this is establishing a kind of hierarchical relationship, but hierarchical not in terms of mutual exclusivity, but harmony. They coexist, they co-interact, they co-nourish each other. So the perspective, one above, one below, is simply that, a perspective. So heaven is honorable and earth is lowly, such are their ranks in spiritual enlightenment. Spring and summer precede, autumn and winter follow. So this is referring to natural changes. The cycle of the seasons is a form of change. And this is how the Chinese understood the four seasons, not in terms of temporality, but in terms of one turning into the other, continuous change. The 10,000 things of the world change and they grow, meaning they are born and they mature, and that is also change. They have their roots, their origins, but they also have their manifestations, their buds. And each of these moments of change have distinctive form. So flourishing and decaying by measures, by degrees, there is a constant flow of change and transformation in the world. So to give further context, we can look at another passage from the Zhuangzi that says, quoting, "The life of things is a gallop, like a galloping horse. It is a headlong dash. With every movement, things alter. With every moment, they shift. What should you do and what should you not do? Everything will change of itself. That is certain." So in terms of natural change, these changes are unalterable. They are inevitable. They are something that is beyond human control. So what the text is saying is changes that happen within us and around us, we should simply accept them as they are and not try to prevent them or alter their path or prolong their path. So change is good, in other words. Another example is the following longer passage, and I'll read this a bit faster. Zhuangzi says, "Who has mastered the true nature of life does not labor over what life cannot do. Who has mastered the true nature of fate does not labor over what knowledge cannot change. Who wants to nourish his body must, first of all, turn to things. And yet it is possible to have more than enough things and for the body to still go unnourished. Who has life must, first of all, see to it that it does not leave the body. And yet it is possible for life never to leave the body and still fail to be preserved. The coming of life cannot be fended off. Its departure cannot be stopped. How pitiful are those who think simply nourishing the body is enough to preserve life." End quote. So this passage is a kind of leeway into our discussion of death. We have indications here that spirit or the essence of life is something that is not innate to the physical self. It belongs to the greater world. Now, if the greater world is constantly changing and transforming, and yet our essence or our spirit belongs to that greater world, then it also must change along with the external reality. So when it comes to life and death, Daoism will argue these are simply inevitable changes. They are neither good nor bad, but natural. They belong to the processes of nature, and these processes are ultimately beyond human control. And then it will argue in terms of the psychology of death, whether we should accept it, whether we should fear it. It will argue that such worries are misplaced because it's simply part of the natural, constant changes that are happening all around us. Now, Daoism also recognizes that change is not limited to physical selves, physical persons. We born and we die. These are two changes that mark the lived experience of things. But in between, there are changes that happen during every moment of our existence. And these changes apply in terms of our emotions, in terms of our language, our use of words, the meaning of words, our perspective of the world, our preferences, so our likes and our dislikes. All of these are constantly changing. And this is why many scholars have argued that Daoism is actually a school of relativism, because everything is relative. It depends on your perspective, right? The meaning of a situation depends on the perspective that you bring to that particular situation. And this includes life and death. So the scale of change is also subject to change. We talk about small changes and great changes, but what is small? What is great? This is a relative designation. And Daoism says there is always something smaller than what you call small, something greater than what you call great. So these are kind of infinite arguments that we can engage in. So it's best that we don't engage in such arguments at all. Everything is change. Now, when it comes to death, Daoism says, why is it that humans alone feel it is a static event? It's a permanent ending to our existence, to our being. If the whole world, if the whole universe is in a state of flux, of constant change, why do we feel the need to say that our life is marked by a finite moment in time and our death is or will be marked by another finite moment in time? So this is what we will discuss. When it comes to the two founding texts of Daoism, I've already mentioned the Zhuangzi. The other one is perhaps more famous and a text that I'm sure many of you have heard about, the Dao De Jing by Lao Tzu. Only the Zhuangzi offers a really compelling philosophy of death. Lao Tzu doesn't talk about it too much. So this is why I'm choosing this text as the basis for my talk. Now, there are many examples in the Zhuangzi about death and about death as change or transformation. And all of these bear witness to Zhuangzi, the author, to his humor, to his playfulness, but also to his philosophical argumentation. And I have chosen one story, one very interesting story that appears in chapter 18 to illustrate this. And this is a story of a skull that is on its own by the side of a road, and Zhuangzi has a very humorous encounter with it. So, because the story is a bit long, I've abbreviated it somewhat, but this is the gist of it. So the text says, Zhuangzi saw a skull by the roadside and asked it, "Did you die by coveting life too much? Did you die by losing the ordering principle of things?" Meaning fate, right? Your fate. "Did you die by the blade of an axe while serving a fallen state, i.e. you were a martyr, you were a hero? Or did you die as a result of an unvirtuous act, corporal punishment? Did you die from cold and hunger, so basically poverty? Or did you die simply from old age. It was your time to die. And then it goes on, we skip the intermediary. So the end of the story, Zhuangzi takes the skull and makes it a pillow, and he falls asleep lying upon it. And then the skull appears to him in a dream. And Zhuangzi is famous for having these dream stories. He dreams of trees, he dreams of skulls, he dreams of butterflies and fish and whatnot. So the skull appears to him in a dream and says the following: "For the dead, there is neither ruler nor subject, nor matters pertaining to the four seasons. Owing to this, our years are akin to heaven and earth. A king may have his throne, but his joy is no match for ours," ours meaning the dead. And then Zhuangzi said, "If I asked the arbiter of fate, and for the Chinese that is heaven, to restore your body to life and give you back your bones and flesh so that you can be with your parents and friends, your neighbors, parents and family, neighbors and friends, would you want this?" Most of us would say absolutely, right? However, the skull glares at him. And this is very funny. And people say, how can a skull glare at you? It doesn't have eyebrows. It doesn't have any skin or flesh. Knitted its brow and said, "Why would I discard more joy than a king on his throne to once again endure the toils of being human?" So this presents a very interesting perspective, the perspective of death from the vantage point of death, that death is not something to be dismissed, disparaged, feared, or so on. And in many regards, it's actually better than life because we don't have the pains and the ailments, the toils of the living. So regarding this story, there are a number of different interpretations or readings. So before I get into my own, we'll just go through them very quickly. The first one is that death and life are two aspects in the round of species change, right? The second one is that death is one of the natural transformations of heaven and earth. The third one is that death is a natural part of the processes of birth, growth, decay, and transformation. The fourth one is that death does not exhibit or subvert life, but stimulates and drives it. We are motivated to do the most that we can in life, knowing that we will die. So death gives life greater meaning. We can also say that death is the realization of the immortal soul. Or we could say that death is the end of our ability to be an agent in the world. We then can say death is an episode in the larger narrative of the universe. Even the stars die, right? Or we could say there is no such thing as absolute death. For me, the story of the roadside skull is Zhuangzi's way of inviting us, the reader, to consider life as a way of death and to see death as a way of life. The question, though, with such an interpretation is, how are we going to participate in the world after we have died? So in my opinion, to die is to lose one's skull. Yes, we lose the living skull, yet the skull, the bone of the skull, survives our death to live on in the world as what I call a skull of the world, meaning it is possibilities of others. So what do I mean by a skull of the world? As we have no real control over our physical skull once we have died, it's there for the world to play with. As we saw with Zhuangzi's story, he picks up the skull, he talks to it, he gets tired, he makes it a pillow, the skull appears to him as a dream. So the skull as a dead thing still has many interesting uses. But can we call such a skull our own if it belongs to the world? If our skull belongs to the collectivity of skulls, if it's going to be a skull of the world, and because we designate the skull a skull representing the dead, then we can no longer make it our own. right? Because we are dead, the skull survives, but the skull belongs to the collectivity of skulls of the world. So we have to thereby look at the skulls in the world as belonging to a greater collective. All the dead skulls form a singular skull, or a collective unity of skulls. And this ties into Daoism's belief that all things exist in harmony or in oneness. So death qua the skull is a way to be alive in that it does not dwell on the facticity of death, on the physicality of death, but uses the knowledge of our futural death to bring balance to one's life. In a later chapter of the text, Zhuangzi says this: life is the tail of death, and death is the head of life. When our vital breath, right, so our living breath gathers, there is life. Yet when it disperses, there is death. When we die, we exhale our last breath, and then we don't breathe anymore, right? He goes on, he says, if life and death are followers of one another, then what is there to fear? It's simply one change succeeding another change. So when Zhuangzi picks up the skull and falls asleep on it, this exemplifies his comfort with death. And it represents Daoism's comfort with death. And the Daoists are famous for this equalizing of life and death. Unlike the Confucians, who are terrified of death, and they ritualize it, and they memorialize death. So taking the skull as a pillow for Zhuangzi indicates two things. The first is that the skull symbolizes the transformation of things from being alive to being dead to being alive while dead. As long as I am Zhuangzi and I pick up that roadside skull and I talk to it, it's alive. It's alive for me, and it's alive for anyone else who encounters it. In Zhuangzi's hands, the skull is alive whilst dead. Given it induces no fear in him, he embraces it as if he would embrace any other object he may encounter. The second reading is on an existential level, we could say. That is, sleeping on the skull as a pillow signifies the self-embracement of life's most inevitable of events. If I can pick up someone else's skull and make it part of my worldly experience, then that says I have the utmost comfort with my own impending death. I'm not repulsed by this skull. So this act, we can say, we are all, as living beings, we are all skulls in waiting. We carry our skull with us in life, and the skull survives us in death. So to sleep on another skull is to be carefree in life. No fear of death whatsoever. And carefreeness is related to the Daoist idea of spiritual transformation. So lying abandoned on the side of the road, the skull in Zhuangzi's story knows nothing about superior or inferior, i.e. that life is good and death is bad, or the cycle of the seasons, that there is a temporally prior and a temporally latter. Life and death become equalized. There is no before and after. So no longer plagued by the physical challenges, the tribulations of life, or the worries that we constantly have about our health, our physical well-being, our intellectual acumen. The skull exists in the world in perfect contentment. He is free of all of these things that haunt us living people in the world. So what is the point of this? Zhuangzi is saying we need to learn as living things to be like the dead skull, to release the bonds of advancing in the world, right? Of setting goals and reaching goals, of trying to outdo others, so on and so forth. We just be a simple empty skull and then nothing can come and harm us. And for Zhuangzi, this is a kind of ultimate joy. Not only is it representing spiritual freedom or a kind of carefreeness, it's also something he takes pleasure in. Right? And the pleasure arises from the emptying out of all the things that we rely upon to shape and measure the success or failure of our life. So we can have two levels of living in the world. One is the physical, the other is the symbolic. For the physical, the skull cannot act without its capacity to shelter what defines it as such, right? The skull is the house not only of our sensory organs, our eyes and our ears and our mouth, but also our brain. It makes us what we are. Yet the roadside skull doesn't have any of this. So is it still a skull or is it not a skull? Right? And yet, as we have seen in this story, the old parched roadside skull does have a purpose to play in the world. Not only for Zhuangzi to pick it up and talk to it, but it acts as a kind of shelter for mice, for insects, for any manner of other little creature who wants to seek protection, right? They can run into the cavity of the skull and find security there. So there are many ways in which the skull has a role to fulfill in the world. Symbolically, the skull symbolizes a futural, desubjectivized version of our present living selves. We can look at the skull and we can say the skull belongs to somebody, but without its identifying flesh, it's no longer recognizable as said person. So this is very interesting, right? We know someone's face based on their facial features, but we never think to say, I know you based on your skull, right? Other than cheekbones or a pronounced forehead or something else, it's very hard to say, I know this person according to their bare skull. But for Zhuangzi, we can do that because all skulls in the world are identical to my own. Right? It's not that we're comparing human and non-human skulls. The fact that all living things, right, have a skull, and that makes us equal. So whether the demise of the skull occurs in its youth or its old age, whether it occurs because of natural or malevolent means, as a skull, there is no escaping the inevitable change that it will face, what we call death, but the Daoists call returning to the Tao. The deathly symbolism of the skull allows it to observe the world, right, from the world, the reality of the dead, and look upon the world of the living, all the hustle, the bustle, the conflicts, the trials and tribulations that we go through, right? And it simply smiles to say, I pity all of you for having to suffer through all of this, where I'm at complete ease and freedom. And yet that it's bare bones, right? Its gleaming white surface, as Zhuangzi describes it, is a reminder to all of us in the living world that we will reach that same inevitable outcome. As long as we do not resist or alter our inborn nature, that we were born, the thing that we were born as, we can say we will continue to enjoy a unity with the Tao even in death. So as long as I don't try to prematurely end my life or artificially prolong my life through medicine or science or what have you, as long as I don't try to alter my physicality, I accept what I am as I am, then I will know I am forever in unity with what the the Daoists call the great ultimate, right? The Tao. Now, given the choice between life and death, in Zhuangzi's story, the skull chooses the latter because it was his fate. It was his time to die, and he accepted that. Following along with the times is, in Daoism, naturalism, right? And naturalism, as opposed to a more human-centered perspective, where I am an independent, autonomous thing and I can determine my own fate, Daoism does not believe in that, right? We belong to a collectivity. Our fate is outside of our control. We are able to alter minor details of our life, but in terms of being born in a particular place at a particular time with a particular form and having a fixed lifespan that is fitting to that form, then anything beyond that for the Daoists is unreasonable, right? It should not even be considered. So refusing to die when the time has come is to artificially covet life out of fear that we will lose all that we have acquired or accomplished in life. So we live life, we measure the success of our life by hoarding things, by amassing things, be it degrees, be it wealth, be it knowledge, be it strength, beauty, it doesn't matter. But we have to remember, when we are born into the world, we are born into the world naked with nothing. And when we die, we return to the Tao, to our root with nothing. So the Tao, life and death, as these two points of transformation, they're simply 2 points in the circle of constant change. And being in a circle of change, they are always equal. So to deny the dualism of death and life is to accept them both. Again, it's relative. What one calls life, another might call death. What one calls joy, another might call sorrow. Having mastered, if we are able to master the arts of the Tao, so living in harmony and unity with all the things in the world, and not discriminating between them in terms of good and bad, right and wrong, then the concept, the words, life and death become empty. They become meaningless, based again on this relativism that we can use to undermine the legitimacy that this is alive, this is death. This is what it means to be alive. This is what it means to be dead. Because as we have said, there are many expressions of life and death. We can be emotionally alive, we can be emotionally dead. We can be spiritually alive or spiritually dead. It's not limited just to the physical. Daoism recognizes that all manner of existence go through these modes of life and death, presence or non-presence, strength, weakness, so on and so forth. So this is why the skull refuses Zhuangzi's request to reincarnate him, because doing so will violate the cyclical harmony that is the ordering principle of the universe, what the Chinese, what the Daoists call the Tao, what the Confucians call heaven. And if we look at other traditions, there are all manner of names to designate the supreme creator, right? But in Daoism, it's the Tao. So in conclusion, Zhuangzi is, for me, in my interpretation, not asking us to abandon our skull. You know, I'm dead, I can't do anything in death. What he's asking us to do is to look beyond the flesh of the skull, to look beyond my face, the thing that I present to the world. That's not important. What is important is that I am a member of the world. I belong to the community of things that comprise the world. And the creation of said things is not of my own doing. It's of the doing of the Tao. So we need to look deeper into what makes things what they are, and not focus and obsess on the external appearance of things. So if we spend more time looking after our own skull, instead of worrying about the skulls of others, i.e. competition, jealousy, so on and so forth. We realize that we belong to what I've called the collectivity of the skulls of the world. And in this way, the existential conundrum that has plagued so many Western thinkers, life, death, the meaninglessness of life, the hopelessness of life, fear of death, so on and so forth, resolves itself because we take what we would call the subjective self and we pair it with the non-self, that is the ultimate self, the self of the Tao, the self that includes all selves, all manner of selfhood. So in this way, the skull of the world is the paradigmatic image of death's physicality, while also pointing to a higher unsayable truth, that death as ontic non-being, so physical non-being, does not equal ontological oblivion. You die, that's not the end of your existence. You live on through your skull. So Zhuangzi's tale of the roadside skull is about nurturing oneself in the Tao through the equalization of death and life. And with that, I will allow our remaining time for discussion. So thank you all for listening.